As I was arriving here to deliver this presentation, I was asking myself, how is it that I'm presenting among these very distinguished professors? So I had this search of meaning. Hopefully I'll be able to solve it. Actually, Professor Erol Göka has already formed a world of meaning for me, so I will be talking in the comfort zone of that. And to the extent that I have listened to, I guess I will be saying things that are parallel to what Professor Göka has already said in terms of giving meaning, coming up with meaning, and how this appears in a person's mind. And how can we make use of this? Maybe throughout the psychotherapy process, in terms of giving meaning to life, what kinds of interventions can we launch? So maybe we can form an idea concerning these issues, and I can wrap it up throughout my presentation. So when you look at the one single Turkish word, anlamlandırma, which means giving meaning, this is this single word in Turkish that attracts my attention. Anlamlandırma. The first syllable is an, which can also mean moment. So when I say I understand you, you are talking about that moment. We say anladım or anlaşmak, to understand mutually. And there's also an there. So it's understand in English. It is referring to a physical stance, perhaps. But in Turkish, it refers to time, moment, the shortest period of time. So maybe you can philosophize this, even though this is not our task per se. So when you look at the word an, the root of giving meaning, which means moment, in the written sources, you go back to the 14th century to see where this word first appears in the texts. And it also has another root, anla, which means distinguish something, comprehend something. So it is a verb now. So if we can comprehend something, then we say we anladık, we understand it. But how about anlamlandırma? Being able to distinguish something vis-à-vis others, comprehend something vis-à-vis others. So if we're going to give meaning to life, this is the kind of activity. Actually, Professor Göka said, I'm not keen on Freud, but I will agree with him. Maybe rather than understanding life per se, giving meaning to life is rather very precious. Therefore, I try to give meaning today. So maybe this is a framework that is a bit outside of psychotherapy, to give meaning. So we are going through our lives as humans, as we're talking about giving meaning to life. So there are various periods of being human. And this giving meaning is a whole process throughout all the periods that we go through. We are actually exhibiting the giving meaning to all these periods through various actions and activities. So especially in pre-adulthood, well, actually all periods have their own characteristics, and I will be ignoring them deliberately for the moment and look at pre-adulthood. In this period, we are exhibiting certain actions. And what is the reference of these actions? Why do we exhibit some of the actions and why not the others? Especially, there are physical needs. Here, we need many psychological needs, physical needs, love, accommodation, food, etc., and reinforcers. So our reference in pre-adulthood is these needs and reinforcers dominance. For instance, if I'm going to exhibit an action, according to what am I going to exhibit it? Of course, in line with the existence of these needs and reinforcers. So how can I understand this distinguishing? Actually, this is Skinner's main principles model of investigating behavior. If distinguishing is a behavior, how is this behavior appearing? If a behavior appears, Skinner says, then it doesn't appear in a void. It always appears within a context. And there are primers and results, conclusions in this. For instance, in an animal experiment, 2000 Hz, and the animal is pressing the pedal, then this is a behavior. And in Skinner's experiment, it was food, right? The lid is opened and the food is available. How, then what does the animal start to discern? So when I press the pedal with 2000 Hz, then I will receive food. So in the experiments, for instance, 1000 Hz, pressing the pedal, no food. Then the animal starts to discern 1000 Hz and 2000 Hz. Is this only in animals? No. Beginning with infancy, when you say the name, when the infant looks at you, then it means maybe a positive effect is at stake, like the parent is laughing, showing interest, and the baby starts to discern her name. And when she exhibits an action upon hearing her name, then she acquires the skill to reach the primary reinforcers. So, in our first periods of life, we are actually functionally coherently discerning something from others. And this way, I am acquiring something that I need, most probably at least. So this is how the whole process works. But is this that simple for humans? Maybe for animals, yes, but for humans, no. Because we have linguistic skills. We have language. We're not only learning to discern physical stimuli, we're also learning to discern symbolic stimuli. For instance, when the child sees a feeder, and if she says milk, and when she sees the feeder and the milk, or if she sees the feeder, but when she says apple, if she cannot reach the apple but only the milk, then she says, let me say milk instead of apple, because when I see a feeder, I cannot reach an apple, but I can reach the milk, the baby says. So, beginning with the first periods of life, we also learn how to denominate things. We name many things. We learn to name things. Of course, it starts with naming physical objects, but bit by bit, we also learn to discern what is going on in our work life. And we are naming everything that we discern. We become aware of our thoughts, ideas, emotions, feelings, and name all of these. So these are learned through reinforcing. If I become aware of anxiety and name it, if my parents do not reinforce it, then I don't name it anymore, because that discerning is not settled in my mind. So we have this condition of not being able to name it because one doesn't receive reinforcer, then one cannot name. So actually, beginning with the earlier stages of life, we learn to denominate, becoming more complex now that we're naming things even in our work life. And there's this process of denominating upon being able to receive something that I need. If I am feeling anxious, if I have anxiety, but then if I'm scolded, then because this behavior is not consistent, coherent, then I try to refrain from being anxious or having anxiety. But of course, linguistic process is a rather very complex process. Symbolic discerning has many complex processes. Maybe you can see some of the examples here. We have very different means of relationships of stimuli through many forms. For instance, take two stimuli. We can put them in the same or opposite framework. So I have given these clinical examples. Maybe difference could be one of the frameworks. I am different from the others is something that you might hear in your psychotherapy sessions. Or we can have spatial or causal or temporal relationships in our daily lives and in our internalized experience. And we can also make use of hierarchical relationships or deictic relationships. Or relationships where there is difference, spatiality, and temporality all together. So we have all kinds of relationships, relation making. So actually, these all actually express the complexity of the linguistic relations. Maybe the last three, spatial, hierarchical, and deictic relationships, are those that we need the most in terms of the linguistic skills of discerning, being aware, becoming aware and discerning things. So I was saying, like, pre-adulthood, during this period, what is the coherency? Reference of an action, it is the physical reinforcements. But when we come to adulthood, linguistic skills and symbolic world is so dominant now. The first needs and reinforcers are now not that important as before, and they are not sufficient, these physical needs and reinforcers, and we might run into a crisis. I think we can call it a very important existential crisis or an important crisis for the psychological developmental stages, because so far my reference was physical needs and reinforces, but now I have a symbolic world, my mind, my language. What will be my reference then? I used to know my references before in pre-adulthood, but what am I going to live according to in my symbolic world? There are so many concepts like success, being loved, being competent, being sufficient. Am I being loved? Am I successful? Am I failing? Am I valuable? Am I precious? Am I worthless? Etc. So now I'm living in a world of symbols whenever that adulthood starts, depending on the person, you know. But here, now we are in a symbolic world, oscillating in 2 points, between 2 points. So how am I going to live from now on? According to what? So, if we can make use of some of our linguistic skills, then we might give an answer to this. As a linguistic complex existence being, how am I going to give meaning to an action? For instance, you're listening to a presentation here. I am delivering a presentation, I'm speaking. So you will leave the hall in a bit and you will start to chat with your friends. Or in the evening, you will go somewhere. So I am exhibiting many actions throughout my life. How am I going to give meaning to all these actions? And for what am I going to exhibit this action? So what we need here is the skill of hierarchical relationships of language. If we can make use of this hierarchical relationship skill, then we can have a functional coherence in our symbolic worlds. Despite very harsh conditions, if I decide to walk on a path, for what am I going to do it? Then I cannot really limit it to my physical needs and reinforces. What is the meaning in my symbolic world? And the answer changes from person to person. The answer to why you're listening to this presentation varies in all of you. Maybe there are some common answers among you, but it is all different in your minds. Your references of coherence in your minds are all different from one another. Or another similar question when we're trying to give meaning to life or a single action in psychotherapy. So, this thing that I'm doing, what does it serve to the things I give value to? Again, there's a hierarchy. See, does my action serve something at the upper end of the hierarchy of meanings? If I can give an answer to this, then there's a symbolic coherence here. Then I can give meaning to this action. And when we gather all these meanings of actions, then there's this comprehensive activity of giving meaning to life that we arrive to. Of course, being able to use the life, then I need to have the skill of symbolic giving meaning, because if you tell a 3-year-old the meaning of life, it won't mean much to her, but for an adult, we're talking about a symbolic means of giving meaning to life. How am I going to give meaning to life? So there's this question of hierarchical relationship when we ask, as a human, for what am I going to live this life? So actually, this is a question that might be useful. Or the question of what do I want to represent in this life? Again, a hierarchical relationship, see? What will my actions serve and what will they represent throughout my life? Is the question. And another question is, sometimes we also meet our need of symbolic safety, because in our first stages of life, it's mostly food, accommodation, heating, like physical needs. But in my adulthood, I also need a symbolic security and safety. So, what will show the way to me in this life? What is going to be my compass in this life? So, I was reminded of İsmet Özel, a Turkish poet and writer. I think it was in Waldo, beginning 1970s, when he ran into a political and existential crisis. He saw many of his friends in depression and suicidal, and he was saying, it is the umbrella that politics and poetry that saved me from this crisis. And this is how he gave the answer to the meaning of life. This is how I understand İsmet Özel giving meaning to his life. So this is also an activity, an action that is maintaining our symbolic safety and security. So, coming towards the end of the presentation. So, is giving meaning to life so clear like this? No. If we're talking about humans, there's always leakage, you know? Because sometimes the actions that look very meaningful from outside that humans do might be because these humans are running away from something, escaping from something. For instance, if there's a relational coherence in one's mind, like feeling pain is illness, then what does this person do to become healthy? Then they exhibit actions that look very meaningful from outside. We see it in our clinics, like there's this idea of getting rid of the feeling of loneliness. So to escape this, these persons go and socialize with their closest friends. From outside, it looks very meaningful, right? Oh, nice, he's socializing, he's meeting his friends. But maybe at that hour, socializing with one's friends at that hour might not be something that he's doing it only to give meaning to life. Maybe he is with these persons to get rid of the feeling of loneliness only. And now that he's getting rid of that feeling, he feels quote unquote healthy. Maybe. But then, this seemingly meaningful actions, is there actually an escape there? Or a hierarchical serving for meaning? So maybe we can ask ourselves, when I look at my life in retrospect, even if it looked very meaningful, actually did it approximate me? Did it make me approach the principles of life that I wanted to represent in that period of my life? So was this an escape really? Or was this giving meaning? So this might be a question that might help us in retrospect. So we can ask our clients this question in our clinics as psychotherapists. Maybe lastly, Viktor Frankl has an important emphasis saying that maybe we should ask what the meaning of life. What is being asked is one's own person. All persons question life can give the answers only by themselves.